All right, we are back with a new video, and today I thought it'd be fun to go through some past Survivor seasons and talk about players that have played before that haven't come back that I would like to see come back at some point. Now, I know there's a lot of videos out there talking about Dreamcasts and second chance ballots and what have you, and this is kind of like that, but I wouldn't call it a casting video per se. This is just me talking about players that I would personally like to see return at some point. Now, obviously, there's a lot of discussion about more recent players, players from David versus Goliath, and players from Survivor 41, which just wrapped up. But for the sake of this video, I'll just limit it to players that have only played once and have only played before Game Changers, as really, but for those players, they've had a chance to come back at some point, but just haven't. Whereas players that have played more recently since Game Changers, they haven't really had much of an opportunity to do so, as there hasn't been a full blown All Star season that has really gone to include them, with the exception of Winners of War, of course. So basically, we'll be going through the old seasons and talk about players that I would personally like to see. And this is kind of like a top 10 list in a way, except I feel like it's better to just talk about players that I personally enjoy watching. So before we get to the list, I would like to run through some honorable mentions. And I have a lot of honorable mentions to run through, but let's just dive right in. So, jumping right into these honorable mentions, I'm just going to be running through them in the order in which they originally played. So, first up, I have Greg Buis from Survivor Borneo. I felt like he was a pretty interesting player first time, definitely a fun character with a lot of funny moments. Obviously, that alone would provide some fun TV moments, and definitely someone who is voted out for being seen as a bigger threat. We saw him being taken out right after the merge, being the first member of the jury, and I feel like compared to a lot of the other Pagong members, he's definitely one that would play more strategically. And while he wasn't the only one, I mean, we saw Jenna and Jervis to a certain extent have some potential. Obviously, they've been back since then, so I feel like they're not really eligible for this. That leaves Greg. The next person I have is a bit of a more, definitely more for a character than anything else, and that's Peter Harkey from Survivor Marquesas. I thought he was a fun presence on the show, even though he was the first boot. Also, the fact that he is friends with Boston Rob, or at least was friends at one point. So I thought it might be funny to at least consider him, but didn't make the final cut. Next, I considered John Carroll, also from Survivor Marquesas. And John was an interesting character as well. He was definitely one of the more dominant figures on the Road to Tribe, was definitely someone that was playing a good game, at least with the old meta of building an alliance, getting the numbers for your original tribe, and then picking off the other members one at a time. I thought he was someone that was playing relatively well within that uh, meta at the time, but obviously was flipped on at the final nine, was taken out there. And I think he was an all right character as well. I wouldn't mind seeing him again, but he didn't quite make the cut for me. Next up, I considered Helen Glover from Survivor Thailand. Now, obviously, Thailand isn't the best season in the world, and definitely not one known for its cast, but I feel like of the people on the cast, Helen Glover is definitely one of the more interesting people on that cast, and definitely one that I would like to see again. Next, I considered Dina Bennett from Survivor Amazon. Obviously, she was an interesting figure for her time, definitely one that was playing relatively strategically for being this like professional woman. And obviously, she was taken out, obviously, for strategic reasons, but definitely someone that I considered. I also considered Rupert Burton from Survivor Pearl Islands. Obviously, someone who was voted out, but then came back in the game through the outcast twist. And I like Burton on the season. I thought he was an interesting figure on the season, won some challenges. Definitely was a figure in the post merge strategically with him siding with Johnny Fairplay. But again, I wouldn't mind seeing him again as well, but didn't quite make the cut for me. Next up, I considered Bubba Sampson from Survivor Vanuatu. I mean, I know he's not the best player in the world and probably not the most interesting character either, but he was at least interesting enough for me to consider him. I also consider Rory Freeman, also from Vanuatu. And again, Rory was a fun character. Obviously, he was someone that really rubbed a lot of the men on Lepevi the wrong way. Obviously, he got to the swap where he almost blew up his game after being swapped on the tribe with all the women, like almost blew up, but then going on that reward and obviously was convinced by his wife's letter to not blow up. I thought that was pretty funny as well. And I also consider the winner of that season, Chris Doherty. I feel like he was another fantastic character and definitely a pretty good player in the grand scheme of things. Like he's the first winner of several that we'll be mentioning in this video. But again, I didn't consider him for this list, but obviously at the end of the day, he was a pretty fun player, pretty fun one-time winner as well. Next up, I consider Greg Carey from Survivor Palau. Definitely a forgotten figure in the grand scheme of things. Like obviously when you think of the Koror tribe, you think first of Tom and Ian running everything, but I feel like Greg was kind of the third in command or third wheel, depending on how you look at it. Definitely a competent player, definitely someone who I would be interested in seeing play again, especially outside the context of this dominant Koror alliance. But again, I didn't put him on the list. And along those lines, I considered Ian Rosenberger, also from Survivor Palau. I mean, he's probably not ever going to play again. And really, that's the case for a lot of these honorable mentions we're running through now. But again, this is just people that I personally would be interested in seeing again. Obviously, Ian was a pretty good player as well. Definitely someone I felt like could have won the game had he not been convinced by Tom to quit the game at that final immunity challenge. If I felt like if he had held on, really stuck it out and won that challenge, then he easily wins the game there. So obviously, I considered him. I also considered Brian Corridon from Guatemala. Definitely an interesting, dynamic player. Definitely someone that went home too early, in my opinion. Obviously, he was voted out in the post swap shot section of the game, but definitely one I'd be interested in seeing again. And also Amy O'Hara. Now, Amy O'Hara I consider more as a character than as a player, but definitely someone I enjoyed watching on Guatemala. Next up, I considered Nate Gonzalez from Cook Islands. I love Nate. I mean, he was a pretty fun character on that season. Definitely an interesting character, and definitely one I would like to see play again. I also considered Anthony Robinson from Survivor Fiji. Definitely someone I sympathize with more. Definitely someone who I felt like had a really bad experience out there where he was picked on a lot by Rocky. Definitely someone who didn't get the best edit in the world, in my opinion. I actually watched an interesting interview from RGP not too long ago of him. And again, he's an interesting guy and definitely someone who I'd be fascinated to see play nowadays, especially now 15 years later. I also consider Dreams, Heard from Survivor Fiji. Definitely an interesting figure. Another person that appeared more recently on these podcasts with Johnny Fairplay. Definitely interesting discussion there. Also considered Todd Herzog from the Office of the Winners Survivor China. Really great player. Definitely someone who has been through a lot. And obviously, with alcoholism and obviously a lot of the stuff he went through post show, now he probably wouldn't be asked to play again, but definitely someone who, based on all the stuff he's been through, plus what he demonstrated on his original season, is enough to make me consider him there. I also considered Ace Gordon from Survivor Gabon. Definitely fun pre-merge character. Definitely someone who I always joke about his accent being fake. And obviously a pretty competent player on his own. Like obviously he's taken out by Sugar, who flips on him despite having been a pretty close ally of his during a lot of that pre-merge, but definitely someone I would like to see get a second chance. Marcus Leaman from Survivor Gabon, sort of the decoy winner of that season. Obviously, another pretty interesting player. I don't know how well he would do on the return, but definitely someone I would like to see play again as well. I considered Taj Johnson George from Survivor Token Genes. I felt like she was a pretty fun and positive presence on the show. I don't think she would ever play again, but definitely someone I enjoyed watching. And I considered Shambo Waters along similar lines from Survivor Samoa. Again, someone probably isn't going to play again, but definitely someone I enjoyed watching and someone that I'm glad made it as far as they did on that season. Next up, I considered two of the older women from Survivor Nicaragua. Obviously, first there's Jane Bright, obviously someone who won a lot of challenges on her season despite being this older woman, and obviously someone who had a pretty notable moment when she was about to be blindsided and she uh, poured water on the fire, saying she started the fire and she was going to put it out. That was obviously a pretty memorable moment. And then I also considered Holly Hoffman, definitely someone who was more insulated than the majority, someone who got to the final four, but obviously wasn't well positioned to get to the end or win at the end, but is someone who I thought had a pretty fun story on the season where she almost quit at the beginning. She tried convincing Purple Kelly to not quit, obviously, when the double quit happened, and obviously someone who I thought was a pretty good player on the season, so I considered her. Then I considered David Murphy from Survivor Redemption Island. Again, another pretty fun player. Definitely someone who I thought might have done better had they not been on a season with Boston Rob steamrolling everything. But obviously, someone who really is noted for giving the David Murphy speech at Final Tribal, where he really made the pitch to vote for Boston Rob. So I thought that was pretty notable there. I also consider Jim Rice from Survivor South Pacific. Again, a pretty fun character. Definitely a pretty notable figure as well from that season. I also consider Jonas Otsushi from Survivor One World. Definitely an understated figure in the grand scheme of Survivor. Simply someone who I enjoyed watching a lot in the pre-merge, but obviously was someone who fell victim to Kim's alliance when she decided to stick with the women in the post merge, but obviously someone I'd be interested to see play again. And along those lines, I considered Sabrina Thompson from One World. Definitely someone who I think might do better on the return. Definitely someone who I think would be interesting to watch, especially now without Kim along, but who knows. Then I considered Zane Knight from Philippines. Definitely one of the most interesting first boots in the history of the show. So obviously he had this plan of creating an alliance with everyone and then telling everyone after they lost the first challenge to vote him out, but then trying to turn it around in an effort to build sympathy. Just a really fun train wreck. Again, this is more of a character pick, but I would love to see Zaynite again. I also considered Lisa Welchel from Philippines. Again, someone who we'll probably not see again given their profile, but again, I was interested by her arc in the season of trying to navigate the game of Survivor despite being known as his child actor, and definitely someone who was seen as America's sweetheart at some point. So I thought that was an interesting arc for her. I thought she played an interesting game on that season. I also considered John Cody from Blood versus Water, again, as Candace's loved one from that season. Obviously, he was largely screwed over by that connection. Obviously, he was voted out largely because of that. But I'd be interested to see him get another shot. I also considered Hayden Moss from Blood versus Water. If you don't know, he's the winner of Big Brother 12. And that's a big reason why I considered him for this list. But obviously, he also played a pretty interesting game on that season. Definitely would like to see him again. I also really considered Josh Canfield from San Juan del Sur. Definitely a more dominant figure in the pre-merge of that season. Was largely viewed as a rival to Jeremy during that pre-merge. Obviously, going to the merge, they had a big showdown. It was pretty notable there, but obviously Josh lost the battle first. So I considered him. I considered John Mish from San Juan del Sur for similar reasons, but obviously he made it considerably further. And I considered Baylor Wilson, also from San Juan del Sur. Obviously, she was a pretty notable figure, kind of a hated figure, but obviously one I enjoy quite a bit. I consider Rodney Lavoie from World Apart. Definitely played a very strong game on that season. Obviously, someone who I don't know if he wins if he gets to the end. I mean, he definitely loses against Mike, but I mean, I feel like if he was against Carolyn and Will, there's definitely a shot for him to win there. Obviously, he gets screwed over by the fact that Mike wins as many immunities as he does, which causes him to slowly winnow down his options. But I really liked Rodney, would like to see him play again. I considered Darnell Hamilton the first boot from Survivor Co. Wrong. Definitely one of the more screwed over first boots in the grand scheme of things. I would definitely like to see him get a more proper shot moving forward. And the final honorable mention, I can't believe we're getting to this, is Jay Starrett from Millennials versus Gen X. Definitely an interesting character. Definitely was a big rival to Adam throughout a lot of that season. And definitely someone I'd like to see play again. So now that we're finally through all those honorable mentions, it's time to make it to the actual list. And I know I'm known for ranking things a lot, but for this video, I'm not going to actually rank these people as I feel like all of them I like for different reasons and definitely people that I would like to see again in different capacities. So instead of ranking them by how much I want to see them play again, I figured it's best to just go through them in the order in which they originally played. So first up on my list is Kelly Goldsmith from Survivor Africa. Again, definitely a player who was ahead of her time. She obviously was a part of Baran for a lot of that game. Definitely really stuck with a lot of those people from there, but also someone who was willing to flip under certain circumstances. And we saw after the merge of Survivor Africa, where Lex assumed that Kelly had voted against him when it was really T-Bird. Obviously he goes on that witch hunt, and she is so disgusted by it that she decides to flip to the Samburus to try to flip the game there. And obviously, had that worked out, that would have been the first major post-merge flip in the history of Survivor, one season before it actually happens. But instead, it's undone when Brandon also flips from Samburu to Boran, and through that, Kelly Goldsmith is voted out there. So I feel like to an extent she was really harmed by the fact that this was an older school season of Survivor, but obviously someone I think would be much more willing to play more strategically, play more dynamically, and really cut people along the way. And that's what really interested me about her, and big reason why I would like to see her play again. Next up is a player who's pretty similar to Kelly Goldsmith in that she was ahead of her time and someone who would have played more dynamically and probably had a much better shot of winning the game even in that time if things had gone better for her. And it's actually someone from the same season as Kelly Goldsmith. It is T Bird. Now, like I said, T Bird played a great game on Survivor Africa, really did a great job at navigating the generation gap on Samburu. Obviously, went over at the swap and agreed to vote with the Barons to take out Silas at that swap. Although I would give more credit to Ethan and the Barons for that. But it's good for T Bird that she was willing to play dynamically there. Obviously, at the merge, she was the one to cast a stray vote for Lex, that which then Lex used to blame on Kelly Goldsmith. And obviously, she does a pretty decent job, really tries to flip the game throughout a lot of the post merge, despite her try being down the numbers. And while she isn't able to succeed and is taking out the final five, I think she showed a lot of potential on that season. And obviously, now she's widely viewed as a favorite to return at some point. She was a favorite among the super fans during the public voting for Survivor Cambodia for Second Chance. She was on the ballot there, but didn't obviously make the cut there. And obviously, she's involved now with RHAP. She is a very fun presence to watch doing her interviews and her discussions with former players. I thought that was pretty interesting and definitely makes me more excited to see her play again. And I would love to see her play again, see how she would adapt to the modern game. So I have Teresa Cooper in the two spot. For my next pick, I'm actually sticking with old school Survivor here. Yeah, and this is definitely someone who's a bit of a funner character, probably more of a character than a player, although I feel like this player would do relatively well in a modern season Survivor, and that is Sean Rector from Survivor Marquesas. I feel like a big reason why I'm including him here is because of his more recent involvement with the Survivor community. Obviously, he was a big part of the discussions during the year-long hiatus about improving racial diversity on the show. Obviously, he was a big figure there. Definitely someone who is willing to play again, and definitely someone who I think is interesting enough to where I would be really happy to see them play again. Obviously, on his original season, he was pretty interesting to watch. Obviously, he was seen as pretty close to Boston Rob during a lot of that pre-merge, but obviously close to Vesepia. In the post-merge, he was part of that flip at the final nine. Obviously, he flipped along with Kathy and Vesepia there. And obviously, they were able to ride the game until the final five, where he is taken out there. I don't think he would have won if he got into the end. I mean, at the end of the day, but he's still someone that I really enjoy watching, and definitely someone who I think would add quite a bit to a returnee season. So I decided that I want to have Sean Rector back at some point. Next up, the fourth player I want to see return at some point is definitely someone who has stated isn't going to come back at some point, especially now with this point they're at with their live. But I was really impressed by their game. And at number four, I have Rafe Judkins from Survivor Guatemala. And I love Rafe. I mean, he played a very dominant game on Guatemala. Like, obviously, he was a major figure throughout a lot of that season, really controlled his tribe both in the pre swap, the post swap, and a lot of that post merge. He was a very central figure on that season. And definitely someone who would have won had he not made that final three deal with Danny. Had he won that final three immunity challenge and cut Danny, he gets at the end with Stephanie and he wins in that scenario. Probably doesn't win in a lot of other scenarios, but at the end of the day, he played a very impressive game on that season. definitely was one of the characters I found more interesting from that season. Now, obviously, he's one of these players that will probably not come back as he is a filmmaker now, and he's obviously working on a project. I think it's called A Wrinkle in Time, where he is very involved with that, and he has stated before that he doesn't want to play Survivor again. In fact, I don't think he's even into Survivor anymore. He doesn't really follow it anymore, although he follows Australian Survivor. So while it is unlikely, he is someone that I personally enjoy, and if he ever were to come back, I would definitely be excited to see it. Now we're moving on to number five, and this player has actually been asked back a number of times at this point. However, their work has prevented them from doing so. But this is definitely one of the higher picks, in my opinion, of people I want to see back. And at number five, we have Earl Cole, the winner of Survivor Fiji. And I love Earl. I mean, from a personal standpoint, he is one of my favorite winners. Granted, he's not the most interesting character in the world, but I really like him as a person. He does a lot of really good stuff. I mean, he seems like a good person in general. Plus, he played a really impressive game on Fiji. He played a very dominant game, was very well respected throughout a lot of the game, and was definitely one of the more dominant players in terms of his winning chances, where he was very well positioned during a lot of the end game. Obviously, he gets to the end and is the first player to win unanimously. Granted, it wasn't. Granted, you had to attribute some of that to the fact that he was against Cassandra and Dreams, but I also think a lot of it is just due to him being very well respected by the jury. I mean, he is someone that I really enjoy watching. Definitely someone that I really would be interested in seeing play again. I mean, obviously, he is someone who I think has a lot of natural talent for the game of Survivor. Definitely someone who I think would be interesting to see adapt to the modern era of the game. Now, would he do as well as on Fiji? Probably not, but I feel like it'd be interesting to see how he would adapt. And I think he would do better than what a lot of people would expect from him coming in. So, like I said, I really want to see Earl play again at some point, and hopefully, if they keep asking him back, at some point the stars will align. Next up, we definitely have one of the more unique characters, in my opinion, or at least unique archetypes, and that is Ken Huang from Survivor Gabon. And again, I also really like Ken. I mean, the fact that he came in as a professional Smash player was definitely one of the more unique backgrounds for any Survivor player in general. And I think he plays relatively well on Gabon. Granted, he isn't without his flaws, but I feel like he does relatively well, is one of the more strategic players on the season. I don't love how he gets so indignant about how he expected Bob to give up the immunity necklace, only for Bob to hold on to it and really hold that against Bob, even at Final Tribal. That probably wasn't the best look in the world. But at the end of the day, Ken is one of the more interesting characters. Like the fact that he has this background of being a Smash player, the fact that he is one of the more strategic players on the season, despite coming in as this seemingly introverted nerd. I thought that was pretty interesting. Definitely a big part of his appeal, in my opinion, and definitely something that I really would like to see in his return. Obviously, now it has been at least 14 years since Gabon came out, so I'll be interested to see how he has grown since then. Next up at number seven is one of the bigger surprises for why this person has been back, but it's definitely one of the more interesting players from their season, and that is Marty Piombo from Survivor Nicaragua. Now, I really like Marty. He definitely came in as this more outwardly strategic figure on his season, was part of the older tribe, and was a really fun presence in the pre-merge of that season. Although he wasn't without his faults, like obviously the fact that he gave his idol away to Sash was definitely a mistake on his end. But he still has some pretty fun moments, like him being a bit exasperated with some of his fellow players. The fact that he tried to convince Fabio that he was a chess grandmaster was pretty fun as well. And obviously, there's his reaction to the double quit, where he was on the jury by that point and he complained about how he wanted to be in the game playing. In general, I really like Marty. He is one of these more interesting figures, definitely one of the more strategic people on his season, and one I really would like to see play again. It really is a mystery to me how he hasn't been called back at this point. Next up at number eight, we actually have the first and only pre merger on this list of people that I actually put on it as opposed to an honorable mention. But this is definitely someone who I thought was kind of screwed over by the cast they were given and also the way it shook out on their season. and that is Kristina Kell from Survivor Redemption Island. Obviously, Christina was one of the few members of Omotepe to call out Boston Rob early on, really try to get people to target him as opposed to staying loyal to him. And obviously, she was immediately put at the bottom because of that, and she really had no way of digging herself out. She finds an idol early on, but is forced to flush it at that first tribal, partly because she was outnumbered, but also partly because Philip outed the fact that she had an idol during tribal, which is a pretty funny moment in its own, but obviously it screws her over. And really, from that point on, she really has no way of recovering, and she's taken out pretty quickly as a result. I feel like Christina is definitely someone who had a lot of potential coming into her season, and I feel like had things shook out differently, she could have done a lot better, but really struggled given the circumstances they were handed as well as the tribe she was on. So like I feel like that was a big reason she struggled on that season. But I think if she were to come back, I think she would do relatively well. I think she has a lot of untapped potential. I would really love to see her get another shot at playing the game. Now we're moving on to number 9, and believe it or not, the last two players on this list are people that were from the same season. But first, we have from Survivor Worlds Apart, we have Carolyn Rivera. Now, Carolyn was a pretty impressive player for me on this season. Obviously, she came in, obviously was able to stay in the majority for a lot of that game. She was really able to build allies with a number of different people, namely with Tyler and later on with Rodney and a lot of those other people that made it towards the end game. She really impressed me with her ability to stay in the majority for a lot of that game. Plus, I feel like she has a lot of potential moving forward as a player. She does in a pretty bad final three scenario where I don't think she really had much of a shot there, but I feel like if she were to come back for another season, I feel like she would do relatively well on the return. She really did impress me on that season, and that's why I have her here at number 9. And now, at number 10, the last player that I really want to see play again is the winner of Survivor Worlds Apart. It is Mike Holloway. Now, I feel like Mike definitely has a bad reputation as he is someone that had to win a lot of immunity challenges to get towards the end, and also a player that's been overshadowed by Ben Drieberg, and another winner who was sort of controversial at the time, was seen as someone who only got to the end because of idols or winning challenges as opposed to positioning themselves properly. And I feel like that's also a reason why we didn't see Mike in Winners at War, is that Ben kind of took his spot. However, I feel like Mike demonstrated a lot of potential regardless. I mean, he did play a pretty dominant game for a lot of the pre merge and definitely some of the early merge. He obviously has this big blow up at the auction, which caused him to have to win all these immunity challenges to get to the end of the game. And obviously, he does that, and it's a pretty interesting story, even if it isn't the best gameplay in the world. But I guess aside from that, Mike showed a lot of fight in this game. Obviously, he had a lot of fun moments as well, like when he ate the scorpion at the beginning of the game, like when he's able to become the swing vote at the final five to put out Sierra, and obviously with him winning Final Four immunity and securing his win at the end. I think there's a lot of really impressive things to Mike's game. Even if I wouldn't have him high on a winner ranking, I feel like he has a lot of skills that would translate to a return, and I feel like he would be an interesting character to watch if he were to come back. So, on the whole, despite Mike not playing that great of a winning game, and despite him kind of being overshadowed by Ben in more recent seasons, I still am really impressed by Mike's potential as a player, and I would be very interested to see how he would do on the return. And there we go. That will do it for this video. I know this was a bit of a different Survivor video than I've done in the past, but I definitely would like to do more of these general topics in the future, talking about players that I would like to see play again. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe. I definitely have a lot of Survivor and reality TV content moving forward. Should be all very interesting stuff to see. But for now, that is the video. See ya.